So I've been looking forward to doing this for quite a while. I've known Oliver for a number of different years, and I'm going to walk through a few things, then we're going to jump into some questions. But first, what this is and why we do it. Fireside chats are really to have just intimate conversations with different leaders in the industry to share the insights and the knowledge that they have, because every time we do this, I learn something. And I'm sure everybody else learns something as well, because when you can find out people that have done different things and you can see what they went through, you may be able to avoid that mistake or approach it in a different way, et cetera. And Oliver is a gentleman's gentleman, and some very interesting things of how he got into this industry. So we met back in 2014, and I met him at eBay. And I took his picture, and I've probably taken a picture of everyone. So he came over to eBay, and he had this crazy notion about building data centers in China in some free trade zone or something, right?
That's exactly right.
That was exactly. And fast forward a couple years, and we met again when I was on sabbatical. And that was in 2016, and we were kicking off iMasons. And we shared a cheese plate over at Santana Row, I believe it was.
Yeah, I remember we started off having breakfast and then met later in the day to finish up and consumed a lot of bottles of wine and Ubers home.
And it was great because reconnecting again, and progress had been made within the China market and what you were working on. But also we were kicking off the idea of iMasons, and then a few months later he joined the board. So what I really wanted was to make sure we had somebody who had international experience, who has gone through this for decades, who has had the scars already, who's learned those lessons so that we could leapfrog, just like I was saying at the beginning. And Oliver, you've been extremely helpful in what we're doing. So Oliver is a very big supporter of iMasons. He's also a friend, and he's been a mentor to me, and I really appreciate that. So
well, that's good. No, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And let me give you a little bit of the accolades in here. This list is long, so he's had quite a career. So Oliver is the CEO of Chayora, if you haven't heard of that company. So they do business development, and they've come to prominence through the focus on development of hyperscale data centers in campuses within China. And by the way, the free trade zone aspect, we went back there in last year, end of last year. And guess what? There's a data center being built, and he's got the free trade zones, and he's got all the elements of it, so the strategy worked. So congratulations. But also, we went and visited Tianjin University, and that's where we started to see the really, really big effort on trying to support tech and the building of the digital age from the young people. And what we saw in that room was more than 50% women. There's like 60+% women in there because they're gender blind. It's just about talent. And it was great, right? And there was 600 plus in that room, and it was overfilled and things, and they just really, really wanted to learn more. And so I gave a presentation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Tianjin is a very interesting city. And that's where your data center is, your campus is built.
Yeah,
yes?
That's right. Yeah,
great.
Very large city, twice the size of London, 16, 17 million people. No one's heard of it.
Wow. So Oliver's background is an entrepreneurial businessman. It runs much wider, and I'm interested in hearing about the stories on this and drawing from it. But he's UK born and educated. He's in the Charter Surveyor, which is a professional association?
Right. Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, so Chartered Surveyor, which is a British thing, but real estate related, contract related, and very relevant to the stuff we're doing in data centers.
And that was his first profession. And then he moved into corporate finance and complex commercial deals, shaping and following his MBA in London Business School. And from a traditional corporate graduate training program in the 1980s, he left the world, or that world, at the age of 27. 30 years ago this year, by the way. Yes, he's still alive, just so we're clear. And
yeah, thanks, Donnie.
There's a heartbeat. Heartbeat's there. And he's been an owner, investor, and business leader since that time. He has been involved in leading or investing in over 20 startups across a range of industries, 20 startups, and from facilities management to professional services to language and cultural training to electrical charging vehicles. And he's also the chairman and MD and CEO of 6 of those business units today, those businesses today.
Well, it keeps me busy anyway.
Yeah, so 6 of them, still. I thought I was busy. So he also has been a principal in buying a number of public, quoted, and private companies with institutional and private backers, and has managed to secure a series of successful exits. So let's walk through this. There's a whole bunch of business views into this one, which I think that most technology folks that come into it lack at the beginning. But when you've got the combination of business and technology, it's a powerhouse. So can you just give me a bit of introduction around that?
Well, I think starting with data centers, given where we are, is probably a good thing to do. And I have to say, my first experience with data centers wasn't a good one. It was around the year 2000 or so. I was involved, and a number of people here will remember an organization probably called City Reach that was one of the early data center developers. And my business at that time was building. We were the construction manager, the project manager for about 4 or 5 data centers across Europe: Frankfurt, Paris, London, Budapest. I think there was one as well. And these buildings still exist today. And when 9/11 suddenly came around, that we'll all remember, was a big shock to the system. I'll maybe say a bit more about that later. I suddenly found myself facing a customer that owed my business, and I was the principal owner in it, well over £1 million, going bust on us. And all of a sudden, you know, a difficult situation got a lot worse. So I decided at that stage that data centers were for the birds, and I couldn't imagine I'd ever get back involved. But actually, a little later, one of the really interesting elements was that I'd had a large consulting group, 1,000-odd people that I was running out of UK, but with a big 300 or 400 people in Hong Kong. And I sold that business in 2002, and we split the group up at that stage, and I went off, did a few other things. And I joined, a few years later, the board of a UK consultancy called EC Harris, where I went in as a senior partner. I met one of my co-founders, Jonathan Burney, there at that time as well. And I decided it would be good to go back, because they'd bought the Hong Kong business. I'd go back, see how many people were still there. And, you know, and in fact, 95% of the people were still there, which was wonderful after 7 or 8 years. But I was, as one does in Hong Kong, I was having a glass of wine with one of our former clients from one of the big banks. And he said, look, great to have you back, looking for some innovation and some ideas. Could you build me a data center I could run in China? And I thought, well, you know, I can build data centers. You know, I didn't do very well financially out of building data centers, but I know how to do that. And I've done a lot of stuff in China. So I said, well, look, sure, let me have a look at it. And, you know, point out of this often that when you get opportunities that are thrust upon you like that, I made a couple of phone calls. I phoned my friends at Goldman Sachs, at Deutsche Bank, at Barclays Capital in those days, and said to each of them, look, what are you doing in China with your data centers? And at the end of the phone, there was, well, that's a really big problem. If you can sort that, then give me a call back. And after 4 or 5 of those calls, I realized that this was a gap in the market that may or may not be addressable, but basically that was how I got into this space. Needless to say, we concluded within a few months that it was possible, but it was going to be really difficult. But we managed to put a team together, we managed to build the capabilities, and, you know, a long road took us to where we are today, which is one of the few organizations that can do exactly that.
So can you expand on the team aspect of that? So you said you built it there, but were there complexities around it? I know just doing business in China is very different than other parts of the world.
Yeah, I mean, building teams, I learned long ago that the most important thing is that you don't recruit in your own image. You need to have diverse capabilities, and I don't mean diversity in the modern era of that. I just mean simply a range of skills and talent that you can draw upon. And when you're in China, what's very important in our business today is that we have to be very Chinese inside China. We have to be very non-Chinese outside China. And the way we've designed the organization is simply to kind of go 50-50 all the way down the line, from our board, our executive team, where there's 4 of us, and that's 2 Chinese and 2 non-Chinese, right the way down into the business. Because when you're dealing with senior government, and we're dealing with government right up to and including essentially the Politburo reports, so it's the top 200 people in China, and these are super powerful, impressive folk. You need to be able to have all the groundwork done by the local teams, and then I, or Jonathan, as the principals in the business, go in and often do the final handshakes and the formalities around it. But equally, when we're working outside China, very often, you know, the guys who are, you know, from Europe or from America will have conversations with prospective customers, but actually the customers ultimately want to speak to somebody who, you know, is Chinese and knows the details. So it works in both ways. And you know, the sort of proverbial seeking a needle in a haystack applied in our particular case. Stephen Tsao, who's the 3rd co-founder in our business, a Beijinger, Chinese national, is that needle in a haystack, because Jonathan and I, when we were looking around to see if we could address the license issues and the power issues, happened to stumble into Stephen on a visit to London, where he'd been tasked by the state grid to go and sell nuclear power stations to the British government, as you do. Only in China do you have that ambition, and of course only in China do you have the patience that meant after 10 years, this was in 2008 or so, but after 10 years the UK did sign its first nuclear power station deal with China. But so you've got to find the right people, but you've got to grab them when you see them. You've got to need a little bit of luck with sometimes meeting the right people.
And in the intro, you were talking about, was this your first endeavor into China? Because I think you were saying before you were doing something with Hong Kong?
Well, this is my fourth business I've owned in Hong Kong. I first went to Hong Kong when I was going through business school, and back in 1988, which you'll all know from the headlines, was a year before Tiananmen Square, took place, and it was interesting going into China at that stage, because we went across, and as one does through, as many of you have been through business school, you go and you follow great leaders, and I had the great privilege of following a chap called Simon Murray, who was Li Ka-shing's right-hand man, ran Huaqian Wanpe at that stage, and I followed him for 2 days with all his meetings around Hong Kong. And it was an amazing insight that just sort of made me realize, it was a great place to go, and, a place that you could make things happen. So a few years later, I went back and set my first business up there, and I've been drawn back really ever since, to be honest.
And so let's talk about your step out from corporate life. So you had your previous roles, but just tell me what that difference was.
Well, I guess that's an opportunity one. I had done a little elective at business school, which was called entrepreneurial skills. And as part of that, you had to write a business plan. And I wrote a business plan that would relate to my then employer, which was an organization today called BAA, which was the British Airports Authority in the UK, about how they could leverage their property skills, and in the world that was then privatization in the UK, how we could sell expert large estate management skills to people who were less good at it. BAA happened to be very good, and they'd given me great training there. And I had the opportunity I set up the first post-privatization venture for BAA, and if you can imagine a nationalized industry suddenly thrust into being a public company, and I set up the first spin-off business. And when I sat down with my then managers and said, well, look, I want to talk about equity, they kind of looked blankly back at me, because this was something which a public sector organization didn't really understand, and the idea that a young 26, 27-year-old would even ask for that was outrageous. But I'd been told firmly by my mentors in those days that if you're going to do something, make sure you understand the outcomes, and when you're setting up businesses, the outcomes are driven by how much of the business you own. So we had quite a long conversation where they wanted me to do long budgets and cash flows and things of that sort, but they never really got their head around the equity side. And so in the end, I said, well, look, if you can't do the equity, then I'll take the idea and I'll just set it up anyway. It was a ridiculous kind of suggestion at that stage, because I'd been to a couple of lectures on the subject and that was it. But I did, by chance, happen to bump into someone, and my life's often been about bumping into people, because you meet fascinating folk at networking do's like this. And I managed to persuade them to invest £100,000, which was precisely £100,000 more than I had available at that time, in backing this business under what, in retrospect, was quite a clever ratchet equity deal. So I would put in £675 exactly. There was a reason behind that, which I had to borrow. And then
this is at 27, right?
At 27,
okay.
Yeah. It was a Barclay card. I don't recommend that as a source of debt, but these days I've found better sources. But fortunately, we managed to sell that business for well, in aggregate, we merged with another business, and we sold it for $12.5 million 4 years later. And I had a decent stake in it, which meant that all of a sudden, I was dangerous, I suppose, at that stage.
You had more than 675 pounds.
I had more than 600. The return was good.
Yeah, it sounds like it might have been. So, did you have any experience with startups at all? I mean, you talked about MBA school, but did you have any of that background?
No, unfortunately, I wasn't bright enough to have done the full analysis on this, because I think when some opportunities come around, sometimes, and you've got to run with a little bit of intuition, and and a decent dose of confidence. And provided the confidence isn't massively misplaced, it can sometimes come together. And I remember when I had persuaded this chap to put 100,000 in, and I found myself in a little office just off Smithfield Market in London, and I realized I didn't have any computers, because I realized you need those for businesses. It's an interesting one here. When I was going through business school, it was back in the day when Compaq, if you recall, was the fast-growing, laptop players. And Compaq had given, I think, about 100 of these to the business school. And so it was the only brand I'd heard of. So I went to Tottenham Court Road and started buying computers. And for years, we bought Compaq only, which sometimes, therefore, sharing the product is good. But the shock to the system for me was that I went to phone the IT department to get my computer delivered and set up, because that's what corporate life does. And I realized I was the IT department at that stage, and I was the finance department. And the real big shock to my system was that I'd never sold anything in my life. And that didn't become apparent to me until a month or so later, when I realized that was going to be quite important. So it was a great idea, but ill thought through. But you have to learn quite quickly in those situations.
But it sounds like diving in head first, figuring out how it's going to work, is kind of the modus operandi.
Well, I think that's right, because opportunities present themselves. Sometimes they take longer to gestate, like what we've been doing in China, and that's for very, very good reason. Sometimes opportunities, if you blink, they're gone. And you've got to make that call. And I think that, I admire, a lot of people in here I know who run their own businesses, who've made that big shout when they've gone out and they've made the decision to, to take on the responsibility of paying other people's mortgages, because that's what it is. And I, have huge respect for people that do that. And I like working with people who've done that as well, because you tend to watch each other's back, as opposed to simply try and compete the hell out of destroying them. And I love that about the data center industry. This industry has got a lot of people who've done that, and it's a really one of the nicest industries I've been involved in. And as we were saying, I kind of entered this industry about 7 years ago now, and it's a really good one.
So let's talk about billionaires. Why not? So I think it's Mark Dixon,
Yes.
Regis. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience?
It was, yeah. The first business I set up, we managed to get a great exit on that. And as part of it, I was locked in for an earn-out, and I had some covenants, which, I'm a very principled person when it comes to commercial and contractual deals. You do a deal, you stand by that deal. And, I'd taken the money into my bank account from selling my stake in the business, and they expected certain things. And part of that was, after I left the business, I had an 18-month non-compete. And by that stage, I'd set up my first other business.
How old were you at this point?
So this would be 32 or
32,
30. Well, we
okay.
sold the business when I was 31, and this was maybe 2 or 3 years later, 33, 34. And when we sold the business, just backtracking a little bit, I sold it to a French water company called Compagnie Générale des Eaux, Vivendi as it's called today. And I realized as I went to my first board meeting in Paris that my schoolboy French was in need of a little bit of enhancement and improvement. And being the kind of AAA guy that I was in those days, I said to my assistant, I said, look, what I need someone who'll come and teach me French at my desk in the city between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., 3 mornings a week, And she came back about a couple of hours later. She says, I found a class you can go to on Thursday afternoons with 15 other people. And I thought, no, this isn't what I need. And we searched around, and there came another opportunity, because, executive language and cultural coaching, no executive wants to fit in with anybody else. They want it at their desk whenever they want it. And we set up, actually, my assistant at that time, who was my, EA, hired her out of Goldman Sachs, super bright lady. She went on to be on our board. But when we sold the business, I gave her a little bit of money as a thank you, and she, because she was very commercial, she turned around and said, well, look, I'll tell you what, I'll take some out of that, and why don't we set up that language business you keep going on about? And so it was the best investment, or next best investment I've made, I guess. I put about 100,000 myself into that one, and that was 21 years ago. So it's now the fifth largest in the UK, and it's a fascinating one. We've done 750,000 hours of one-to-one, and
So it's just amazing how these little opportunities keep popping back up, and that's
well,
more than
it was a gap that needed to be filled,
Yeah.
and nobody else was doing it. And again, it was a premium service to the right people, and we teach people all over the world today. Just last week, I had to source I don't do much for that business. I'm chairman, and we meet for dividend meetings, which is nice. But Sue, who runs the business, is amazing. Great woman, fabulous business leader. And she called me up. She said, I need a specialist in this biomedical area in Hong Kong to teach Mandarin to someone who lives 3 blocks from me. So I could help.
Wow. I remember a story that you told me, and I think it was around that time, where you were invited into a board meeting. I don't know if this is within the non-complete time or whatever, but you had they asked you some questions. Tell me this story.
No, this was quite a nice one. When I was out of my earn-out and I was looking to get back in, my core industry in those days was outsourcing, support services, facilities management, and over the years I ran a number of those businesses, which is exactly, frankly, what we do here in data centers. We're providing a soup-to-nuts solution for people that need expert partners to work with them. But I'd been approached by a private equity house, first time I had dealings with those lovely people, and they'd invited me to come along to potentially go in as a chief exec of a medium-sized public company they were looking to buy in London. And I knew the business, and I'd competed with them in the past, and they said, look, come along, and if you can ride shotgun on this as our technical expert, we'll do a deal with you. Could be interesting. And I went to the first few meetings, and I went through the due diligence, and the more I dug into this, the more I was thinking that this is not what they think it is. But the lawyers and the accountants and the others were building in numbers, and they're all getting hungry for their fees, as they do. And after about a week and a half, I could see that this could be very lucrative for me, but actually it was the wrong deal. So I called the principal to one side and I said, look, this is a dodo. This is not going to survive. And he said, well, why? And I said, well, there's these reasons, 1, 2, 3, 4, and there's this amount that's got to be invested, 4, 5, 6, 7. And he said, okay, you sure? And I said, yeah. And he said, so what are you saying? I said, you shouldn't do the deal. And he sort of, okay. And we walked into a huge meeting room. There was 20 people on their side, 20 on ours.
How big is this deal?
A couple of $100 million sterling, so reasonable. And that was, so we sat at the table, and the lead on my side, I was at the end, I thought, well, I've done my bit, and we'll see where this goes. At least I've been honest. And he said, look, you need to point something out, ladies and gentlemen, that I've just been talking with Oliver, and he says we shouldn't do the deal. Deal's off. And,
so hold on. You guys got that, right? He's in a boardroom. 27, right?
Well, no, I was 31, 32 maybe.
31, 32, but everyone else in that room.
Well, I'd never done a public takeover and never done private equity, but I did know the business was a dog. So having pointed this one out, he exchanged notes with the guy across the table, and they said, you're joking? And they said, but we've all worked on this for so long. And he said, look, deal's off. I'm afraid we're sorry, but we're pulling. So we all stacked, and we all wandered outside, and everyone's muttering, and no one's talking to me. And and the nice thing was that the guy came across who'd led the deal, and he said, look, that was a big call, And he said, and I think you're right. And he said, so why don't we have lunch next week, and you come back, and if I gave you 100 million sterling to deal with, what would we go and spend it on? And so I walked out thinking, sometimes, good opportunity out of that. So not £100,000 this time, but £100 million at that stage.
Yeah, I think there's just such a lesson in that where you're doing the right thing. It just all comes back around. I mean, they basically gave you more than 100 million. Please go back and invest it this way.
Well, I couldn't find a way to spend 100 million, to be honest, and because actually, it's as many people here will know, there's a wall of money out there if you've got great ideas, great people, great prospects. Finding deals, and a lesson to anybody out here who's who's on the delivery side. Always remember the negotiating power, because you usually feel that you've got no power because you need money and they've got it. But the other side of the same coin is that you've got a platform and they need it too. And so, very often negotiating leverage comes from understanding in greater detail precisely what's driving the other side in the story.
So you talked earlier about your first exit, right? And can you tell me how you approached things after that exit? Was it different?
Yeah, no, it was. I was awful to start with. I think, I was 31, I'd sold a business, I'd paid off all my mortgages, I had a load of cash, and I was able to invest something. Not like the money people make in data centers, I hasten to add, but it was old-fashioned money in those days, so it was enough. And I knew everything, in inverted commas, at 31 years old. And because, frankly, everything I'd touched had happened to have gone right, and it was good. I felt that, if you can do that in one area, you can do it in lots of other areas. And kind of scrolling fast forward, one more point, I suppose, at that point, I became unemployable at age 31, and I remain that proudly to today, on the basis that when you have created some capacity to do things differently, you don't tend to do things that you don't like. I'm not petulant, but I do strongly believe that actually, if I don't agree with what we're doing, I'm not going to hang around. I'll just politely make my goodbyes, and then I'll move on, because I don't need the job tomorrow. I need to work because I love to work. But at that stage, so at 30 years old, I knew everything, and I became unemployable. Scroll forward 10 years. When I was 40, we did the public takeover, actually, with some of that private equity money. And we had built a cracking position, and we're about to go for a pretty lucrative exit. And suddenly two things happened. I mentioned before that damn data center business, City Reach, went bust. And it went bust precisely 3 weeks before a notable date, 9/11, happened. Now, again, any of you who were in the game at that time, you'll remember that it was like a tsunami. The money ran out of every sector around the world in minutes. And only if you were sitting on significant cash were you not suddenly looking over the edge. And all of a sudden, having built a business there, I realized at 40, I certainly didn't know everything. I kind of knew nothing. And I had forgotten to take account of the externalities, the stuff you can't control, but that you have to respond to. And that was a real stunner to the system. I lost a bit of money there. I was still up, which was good, so I was still unemployable. But it was a good balancing act. And I think, you come through experiences like that with stripes on your back from, having to deal with, difficult situations. And it was tough. But 10 years later, of course, you look back on that, and you've learned from the experience, and you move on. You can start to really add value. And so from knowing everything at 30 to knowing nothing at 40, at 50, I realized I could add some wisdom to the odd board here and there. And that's what I love doing these days, which is trying to help people not panic when, the proverbial is heading towards the fan, and actually recognizing that most things are manageable, but you've got to be focused in how to do that.
So tell me what happened next.
I recognized having all your eggs in one basket was never the best thing in the world. And so I started to pluralize over a number of businesses, and I invested in a few areas, always with a common theme. Almost everything I do, the language one was slightly different, but pretty well everything I do has got three common features to it. Number one, it's got real estate somewhere, because that's what I kind of really know about. Secondly, there's always a corporate finance play. The bigger the money, the more complex the deal, the more interesting, and the better value I feel I can add. And then thirdly, rather strangely, it's usually about dysfunctional markets, and that means there's governments often involved. So I got heavily involved in, those out of the UK will understand things like PFI, the Private Finance Initiative. I got involved in advising the president of the Maldives, which was a fascinating exercise for about 6 or 9 months, until I realized that his level of FCPA, and anti-bribery and corruption standards were significantly different, should we say, from ones that I was happy with. But it was nonetheless very fascinating to be dealing with the ruler of a country who was looking to do good things. He wanted to raise $1 billion to build some schools and hospitals and bridges, and thereby buy the electorate's faith to get re-elected. And it was fascinating that I was able to put a deal together with them which effectively used the natural resources of the Maldives, which they didn't have any money, and they made all of that money from fishing and tourism. Couldn't do much with fishing, but on the tourism side, I said, well, look, if you give me some islands, we can then trade those with some of the big hotel companies around the world. We collateralize that, and all of a sudden, bang, I can build your bridges and airports and do what you need in the country. We ended up bringing Chinese money into that area. But as I mentioned, when it became apparent that they weren't going to turn over the new leaf that they needed to, again, point of principle, I don't compromise on those things, and I had to pull stumps.
And that has paid off for you in spades, correct? So the principal part of
I mean, it was interesting. Years ago, I joined the board of Regis. You talk, no, so Mark Dixon, one of the really inspirational people in my life is a guy called Mark Dixon. He's the chairman of what is known colloquially as Regis, which is the world's largest serviced office provider. And when I was in my anti-compete period back in the late 90s, I decided to go with Sue, who was running my language business, to Mark Dixon, whom I'd met at a conference when we were speaking together, and said, look, how about you give me the right to sell language training to all the people who sit in all your offices anywhere in the world? And Mark turned around and he said, well, what's in it for me? And I said, well, what needs to be in it for you? And he said, well, give me 20% on everything that you sell, and you can have the deal. So we're 3 minutes into the meeting, and it's the biggest deal we've ever done as Babel. And Mark said, so look, Ollie, he said, you know, what are you doing? I heard you left the company Simons. He said, I need somebody who understands property to join my board. Have you got any spare time? And I said, well, I had quite a lot, really, because I was thinking of going skiing and you know, just doing some fun things. And he said, look, no, forget all that. Join the board. I'll give you a wad of share options, and we can have a bit of fun. And I had an incredibly fun time with Mark. And what he was the most talented entrepreneur I've ever met. He's worth £1 billion, you know, today. But I remember sitting down and eating pizza with him to work out how we could make his business worth 50 million, not 10 million, which it was at the time. And he's the only guy, I have to say, I know who has been worth over $1 billion and then has lost $1 billion and then has got it back. And that's tenacity. And, you know, he had a bad couple of years straight after 9/11, but got back to the top table and runs an incredible global group today. So, you know, with Mark, one of the interesting tests there was that you know, the share options I had were very significant, but I found you know, was unemployable, really. Mark runs, he's a great friend, but he runs a show where, you know, he's the decision maker in the group, and if you're happy with that, that's great. But for me, I wanted, you know, to have more control. And I made the decision after a couple of years working with Mark. We'd done some amazing things, opened a couple of hundred business centers for him from 65 to 250. And in sitting down with Mark, he said, well, look, you know, you can have an office space whenever you like. So he bought loyalty wonderfully. Bought loyalty sounds cheap. It wasn't. He made a very generous gesture, which I valued. But also, you know, he's gone on to do some amazing things on those fronts. But I had to make the decision when I left, if Regis ever floated, what would my shares have been worth? Because I had to leave them behind. And I was very proud when they did float about 3 years later, and I saw they'd have been worth maybe 20, 25 million sterling, that I was big enough, you know, with a quivering lip, I have to say, to smile to myself and say, the boy's done well. But there was a twist in that tale, because actually that was before he lost the billion, and they all lost their 20s. And so it probably was the right answer. Well, it was the right answer, actually, because I went on and did much more fun things.
So just from Mark's standpoint, what did you learn from him? Like, what are the top 3 things that he taught you?
He taught me customer service. Embarrassing, but, you know, as long as you don't tell anyone here. I'd run a business that I'd owned, and we'd been the most successful in our market in support services, delivering customer service to corporate headquarters. And when Mark hired me and he said, look, take a couple of weeks, fly anywhere in the world on the best airlines, stay at some of the best hotels, but come back and tell me what you've learned about service. And I thought, slightly strange. And he said, but by the way, there's a guy we want to hire on the Intercontinental in New York, a guy called Gerrit Quambush. Make sure you go there and hire him if you think he's any good. And so what I did on that, when I went to see Gerrit, he said, look, I can't teach you about customer service, but I can employ you for one morning chambermaid you know, shift, and I can stick you behind the concierge desk for another shift, and you'll learn more than you'll ever learn from anything else. And boy, was he absolutely right. And there's a longer story on that we haven't got time for today, but the detail behind getting customer service right and this fixation on not being satisfied with nearly was where Mark was. And he was also a complete true entrepreneur. He'd made his money initially by selling, you know, bread rolls and burger vans in Essex, and you know, had kind of, you know, bought the bakery and then bought the headquarters and then moved into serviced offices and done a load of things besides, including a very fine wine chateau that he owns in Provence these days, which is good fun. So I learned a lot about that. To aspire to a chateau in France, I don't think it's a bad idea.
That's not a bad one to aspire to. So what opportunities do you focus on now?
Well, 100% focus on Chayora. We're at a fascinating inflection point. We've invested heavily. We've got to a point where, everything's teed up, ready to go. And then sometimes things creep round the corner. And in this particular case, it's a certain gentleman who's running the United States of America at the moment, who actually is doing the right thing in respect to China. But, the trade war that we're currently facing at the present stage is going to create a bit of challenge for the next few months. I think it's a really important issue that for the world that China and the United States find a positive way forward, which I think both of the leaders are talented when it comes to the fundamentals, and I'm sure they'll be working hard to try and achieve that. But what we're focusing on is ensuring that the platform is there. China is a market that's never going to go away, and the scale of it and the growth in technology means that if the trade war becomes a permanent fixation, then we've just got to price things differently, because that's how we're going to have to do it. And I think back to that, I got quite involved in some solar energy and renewable schemes in sub-Saharan Africa a few years ago, and this was just at the time when solar panels were being reinvented by the Chinese, and the costs were dropping and dropping and dropping, and all of the economics of solar power generation in Europe and Africa at that stage were being rewritten. If that's potentially what's going to happen, if there is a deep trade war, then that's the worst that will happen for us. I personally think I'm very optimistic about the outcome, because I know a large amount of what's in the proposed trade agreement from our sources in Washington and Beijing. It's an amazingly interesting deal for the United States if something close to it can be got across the table, and I think that'll be great for us. But I do continue to chair a number of other businesses on a very non-executive basis, and this is my view of all eggs in one basket, really. I have a merger and acquisition brokerage in the UK, FCA regulated, where we advise people on mergers and acquisitions, and have an amazing team in that group. Still got the language business, and one of the ones that's a real surprise is I took a little position, which became quite a large position, in an electric vehicle charging organization in the UK. Now, electrification and driverless cars, I'll be talking about tomorrow, if anyone wants to hear about that. But actually, putting in the infrastructure is a little bit like, what Exxon and Shell and the guys were doing back in the 20s and 30s. This is a land grab. So at the moment, we're actually on Friday of this week, we're completing a £60 million next round financing of that particular business. I'm chairman of that. But as part of this, I'll step down to just be a non-exec of the business.
This is the charging
business.
Charging business itself. So all the cars across.
So this is rapid charging, which is currently 50 kilowatts, going up to 150. And there's a gentleman in the room around here that was talking to me last night about the new electric Porsche that's coming out that will charge at 450, Joe. So 350 kilowatt charging. So you'll be able to get 400 miles, 80% of 400 miles charge in 15 minutes, and the car goes around corners and goes very fast. So, I'm going to go for a ride in his car very soon when it comes in, because I need to trade up my Tesla.
So two things I want to go into there. You said a land grab. So this is about just the real estate play, because you say everything you do is a tie into that real estate side?
Yeah, no, it is actually. I hadn't thought about it that way. No, this fits the profile perfectly. Electric cars are a fact. They're not going to go away. The world demands that we move to electric. The British government in particular, and other governments are very similar, are actually very bad at putting in public infrastructure. I saw that with hospitals and other areas. When we did Canary Wharf, and I worked on that with Olympia and York back in the 80s, but when Canary Wharf was built, the government hadn't got round to putting in the rails, the extension to the tube network, which is why the Docklands Light Railway, as people will know it, exists, because it was faster and actually was the only way of getting 15 people across, difficult part of London. But the UK has failed to put in public chargers, and it wouldn't do that today anyway, philosophically. And so there's a gap in the market. There aren't enough chargers. There's a lot of demand for it. When you look at any parallel like cable TV, you look back to the original fuel filling stations back in the 20s and 30s, it's really simple. If you get the best locations on the best and busiest roads in the area where people have got the most electric cars, and you just sit on those sites, you put the infrastructure in, and then you sell, there'll be a consolidator that will come around the corner. It'll probably be one of the oil industries, or it'll be a public utility like an electricity company in the UK. But we're aiming to be number one in that market. We want to stick 2,000 chargers in the ground in the next 4 years. And the land grab simply means that when we're doing our assessment of where the charging point should be, you need to know where all the other ones are, because no one's going to put a charge next door to the other. They separate out like Brownian motion, if you like. They spread nicely around the country. And if you get all the best locations faster, so we're using AI and technology to distill and get all of this amazing traffic data and pollution data and land ownership data. And then you go to the folk who own the land and say, how do you fancy something for nothing? So they don't pay. We pay them a small rent, and they get something that under planning they've got to do anyway. So it's a kind of no-brainer.
So as I listen to you, and again, in our conversations in this one today, you seem to be able to look around corners and get an idea, and you're tying this to your core principles of around the real estate, your fundamentals, what you're good at, and all these business ventures and things that can come from there. You recommended I read a book called AI Superpowers. Yeah, great. And we're going to have a conversation here about how we can engage with China, right, from a professional association standpoint. Can you give us a view of what it means to be in China, what it means to compete in China? Because that book was very, very interesting around those facts.
Well, I'll start with an important sort of truism. I've only been going to China for 30 years, and I only go to China 50 times a year now. So I'm only scratching the surface, and I think that's the reality about China. The book was written again by one of Joe's former colleagues, Kai-Fu Lee, who was, I think he was president of Google China back in 15 years ago, something like that. Remarkable book. I do recommend it. It's called AI Superpowers: China versus Silicon Valley. And I just recommend you get a hold of that. Really interesting book from a number of different levels. But actually, the thing about China that, and I'll cover some of this in the presentation I'm giving tomorrow, actually, but the thing about China that all of us who are not from China kind of forget is that it's really, really big. Land area, it's the same, almost within 1% as that of the United States, all states included. But when you start going to China and you see cities that, the biggest city in China is a city called Chongqing, 32 million people, size of Mexico City. City limits are the size of the country called Austria in Europe, and 4 times as many people in that city as the country of Austria. That's the kind of things that, when you go in there, and you go in there with any predisposed views about market analysis and how you're going to sell, FMCG to the, people of North China and South China, it's just different. One of the things I'm inspired by at the moment is the approach to driverless cars, where China is throwing money at a government level into AI and machine learning. I saw a brilliant picture of Baidu, one of the big cloud players in China. They had a column of 55 driverless vehicles, all the same, identical vehicles, driving with no one in them down a motorway, going around all the corners, 55 cars. It's like a convoy, which was extraordinary. And what they are doing in China is recognizing that actually getting driverless cars to cope with places like, the city of Rome or, back streets of the city of London, maybe you've got to think differently. And they think slightly differently by saying, well, why do we start with trying to get driverless cars to drive around the cities we've got? Why don't we understand what a driverless car can do and what electrification is needed and build the cities around those driverless cars? And there's a city called Xiong'an, which is just 100 kilometers south of Beijing, which is under construction at the moment, and the roads have dictated the city, and it will have 2 million population by 2022. That's nearly the size of Chicago. It'll have just as many high-rise as well, just out of interest. And I think when you see a country with singular leadership, and particularly singular leadership with Xi Jinping at the moment, who is a very powerful, very focused, very effective leader. The positives about an environment such as that are that you kind of know what's going to happen. When you can set a 5-year plan in the same way as a dominant corporate might, say an oil major, but you're applying that to a country of 1.4 billion people, things kind of happen. So everything that I'd ever learned about scale had to go out of the window. And when we started designing the Chayora campus, I can remember having a conversation with one of the European industry leaders in data centers a few years ago, and he said, look, Oliver, he said, look, I kind of get where you're coming from, but I've got 3 points which I think you ought to think about. He says, firstly, I don't think China will ever really adopt the digital world. Secondly, you'll never get data centers arranged on campuses because that's kind of too high risk, and thirdly, you'll never get a license in China. And I kind of like those challenges to a certain extent. I knew the first one was wrong. I thought the second one might be, and the third one was, well, I had a license already, so I knew that one was wrong. So.
Did the license cost you more than 675 pounds? Just wondering.
License cost me much hair. Well, much dark hair that's now gone grey hair.
Too funny. So I want to end with a couple things. So first, mentorship. And what we do here at iMasons is really about this connection. And so when you can meet people that you can have a conversation with, that's more of a trusted advisor to be able to say, hey, I'm having this challenge. And I'm not sure exactly how to approach that challenge, right? Or I'm thinking this way. What do you think I should be thinking differently about? And you and I had a couple conversations about that. And one of them was when we were driving in China. And we were driving down to see the campus, right? That crazy idea you had way back when, that turned into reality. Real. Yes. And we were going to Tianjin. And Tianjin is about an hour and a half outside of Beijing, right? And this is one of those cities where the government just does it. They plan the whole thing. And when we say, well, there's 300 megawatts here and whatever, they're doing whole grid structures of the entire city first. And they build it really to be purpose for, say, data centers right now within that region. And so anyways, I want you to just give me a little insight about leadership when it comes to tough decisions from a people standpoint.
Yeah, when it comes to people and recruiting and building teams, in a personal capacity, I've probably hired 1,000 people over the last 25, 30 years. And I've looked at psychometrics, and I've had HR people and consultants and the like doing it. But if I'm really honest, and I am really honest with myself these days, 50% of the people I've hired have not been good enough. And 50% of the people I've hired have been good enough. And of that 50%, half of them have been amazing. And that's a kind of metric I generally apply, which has meant that sometimes you get into business and you get into business with the wrong partners, or you hire the wrong people in a business. And I'm really firmly of the view that if it's not working for me as the employer or as the colleague, it's probably not working for the individual as well. And so to get the really tough decision, which is when you do sit down with people and say, you know what, well, it's been fun, but I think it's going to be more fun for you if you go and work somewhere else, which is one way of putting it, then it's a really important thing to do. But to do that, in the way that it would be done to oneself, to do that in a way that is fair to everybody else in the business, and very importantly, to do that sooner rather than later. And it's tough to do those type of things. Equally, it's tough when you're, say, working with a customer or a client, depending on what sector you're in and what you call them, to realize that sometimes, I'm not in favor of actually doing business with people I don't like. And that sounds awfully kind of illogical business-wise, but I think if you don't like the people across the table, you're never going to make as much money if you could find and spend your valuable time and money with someone you do like across the table. And I learned that lesson early on. I secured in one of my early businesses a massive contract with what was Her Majesty's Inland Revenue Service in those days, which was the tax collecting department of the UK. And I'm sure there are some very nice tax collecting people in the UK, but I didn't meet any of them in those days. And just as a very, if we've got 1 minute on that, I mean, one of the things there was that we ran all of their properties in the UK. It was a big outsourcing deal. I think it was about 700 properties, and each month I'd go along as the chief exec of the business, and I'd sit down with my team, and we'd be going through the review of the performance. And even when it had gone really well, someone before the end of the meeting on the other side would suddenly say, but I had a call just when I was coming in, and they'd explained some catastrophic disaster that undermined all the good stuff that had gone before. So we started to learn from that, and we take them to one side as we're going into the meeting and say, you got any curveballs, anything new coming in? And they'd say, no. But then, of course, a note would come in during the meeting, and they were just bully boy tactics. And, I don't tolerate being bullied or seeing people being bullied. And so I was losing good managers because they weren't prepared to work there. We weren't making the money we could. And when it came to rebid, we just bid 3 times the price we bid before, which was, I'm so glad we didn't get it at that price, but, it wasn't worth any money to have that contract there. So, tough decisions are sometimes, that you've got to make difficult decisions with people. Sometimes you've got to do really difficult decisions to support really good people. And, it's never worth working for people who don't respect you.
Yeah, and I think just to expand on that from our conversation, throughout my career, a few different times I've had to do these conversations. I've had to have these very difficult ones. And what I found also is, like you said, that relief point. Like, people come in, and sometimes when you're in a position, they're actually not the right fit for that position, and they're trying very hard to just make it all work. And so trying to help them go back, and the respect aspect of it, because you never know who you're going to work for, you never know who's going to work for you. It really comes down to integrity, because it is a small business, a small world. And how you make those relationships and how you act and how you do those things will come back to you in the way in which you respond to things.
That's totally correct. I mean, I think, always do as you'd be done to. And I think, and never do things you wouldn't want to read about on the front of a paper. There's 2 guiding principles. But I think integrity is hard won and easily lost. And I think, principles are things that, you've got to be clear on what does matter to you. And you've got to be clear, perhaps, when you meet people who have different views, why your view is maybe equally valid, but, you have to agree to differ. But, if you don't stand for anything, I think as some people say, you stand for nothing. And, that's not my style.
Excellent. So we're going to wrap it up with one last question. Can you tell me the top 3 leadership lessons that you've learned in your career?
I'll give it a go. I think, firstly, you need to be very clear on what could be and what will be, i.e. the vision piece, and why you want to do that. A lot of people chase stars that when they get there, they're not worth having. So firstly, being really clear about what it is. And then having become really clear on that, I think you've got to be open to opportunity, because it comes knocking from every different direction. And sometimes it can be surprising where value lies. So number 1, be clear on what you want, and don't go hunting it, but hunt it whilst looking around on the way. So I think that's number 1. I think the second one would be that when good things happen, learn from them. But when bad things happen, really learn from them. You might not make money, but it'll be the best education that you've ever paid for. And I think the principles are that, when things are really tough and you get through them, with the benefit of hindsight, 5, 10 years later, they're actually never quite as bad as they appeared at the time, because you've got perspective. And great leaders develop perspective around crisis situations, so they don't panic. They try to make the best. They might not succeed, but they'll get the best mitigated outcome possible. So you've got to know yourself, and you've got to learn from every opportunity. And then the third one for me would be that you've got to love what you do. If you get up in the morning and you're not looking forward to what's happening in the day, if it's going to be tough, it's going to be grind, you're dealing with shitty people, and you don't want to do the stuff that business is doing, feel your heart, listen to the moment. I think the point you said to me the other day, the heartbeat test, and you've only got a limited number of these. And so if you're doing something that you hate, be big enough to do something different. And that applies in kind of all walks of life, of course. It's always tough to make those really big decisions. But once you've made them, and so long as you make them in the right way, with respect to the people involved, then you've got to move on. You've got to do the next thing in the right possible way. So for me, it's I think they're all quite personal ones on there, but I think those, if those translate into strong leadership and good opportunity, and very importantly, good value for the stakeholders and the shareholders that you work with, then those are good guiding principles.
Wonderful. Well, Oliver, thank you very much for giving us the insights in this.
My
and
pleasure.
For all of your support of what we do here. So we really appreciate it.
Thank you.